everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
You are very welcome today to our channel. We are two social scientists with PhDs who love having conversations about everything from systemic racism to romantic tropes in Bridgerton and anything that could possibly be adjacent and or fall in between. That is what we will talk about. We are educators who focus on empathy and inclusivity around all of those topics and anything that intersects. We talk about pretty much anything and we'll film it, which is, again, what we're doing here today.
This particular video is part of our ongoing commitment to analyze popular culture output, whether it is in television or movie or podcast or documentary. Anything that is streaming and accessible to us is fair game. We will admit to being particularly attentive to stories by and about marginalized groups. We tend to focus on women, but this documentary that we're talking about today gives us an excellent opportunity to focus on another marginalized group with intersections with gender and sexuality and bodies and a whole lot of other things. Today we are talking about the 2020 documentary Crip Camp, which debuted at the Sundance Film Festival last year and is currently, we're recording this in March of 2021, nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary. It was executive produced by Barack and Michelle Obama, and it was acquired by Netflix at Sundance after winning the Audience Award. And I can tell you, I understand why it did.
Yeah, that makes sense. I buy that.
Our guide into this is a gentleman named James Lebrecht, who was a camper at the camp that we're talking about and has acquired quite a lot of footage that was filmed contemporaneously at the camp by a People's Movie Project that is the most 1970s thing I've ever heard in my damn life.
Oh my God, so much of this was so 1970s, like peak 1970s.
Peak 1970s. So essentially it's the story of the camp, and then what came from the camp, which too long didn't read, is the Americans with Disabilities Act and the disability rights movement.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm reading Camp Jened, Jened. No, we are never told what that means.
Yeah, never explained why it was named that.
It's a summer camp in New York described as a loose, free-spirited camp designed for teens with disabilities. Amazing. There's lots of time spent with the idea that everywhere else in these kids' lives, they are their disability, and at the camp, they are a kid, and what that looks like, their first dating, their first kisses, their first, a lot of teenage stuff happens at this camp. And I know I have a friend who works with the Capernaum section of Young Life, which is entirely camps for students with disabilities. And that she uses the same language now, that we create safe spaces for them to not be restrained by their bodies. And so I'm really glad this was around Lake George, and is not far from Woodstock and has that energy.
Yeah, it's a very upstate New York vibe going into this whole camp. Yeah.
So then one of the things that I loved the most, and plot-wise is really important, is the teenagers make the point that before the camp, they had no dreams or example that life could be different. And what the camp gave them was hope. And hope, friends, is a dangerous activism, because what they realized is that something different was possible. And from there, there became a lot of agitation around the disability rights movement, which led to a long sit-in at one point, which led to President Carter's administration maybe helping, President Reagan's not helping, and then the Americans with Disabilities Act signed in 1990. Dr. Hinson and Dr. Erin and I were both struck by a few things in our own selves as we watched this. So before we kind of get into that and talking a little bit more, we want to say that we cannot recommend this enough. We talk about a lot of really hard sits here on this channel. We tell you lots of times to watch things about sexual assault and some other things as such. I don't love anybody very, very deeply in my every single day life that has a physical or learning disability. I have in the past loved people who live their lives in wheelchairs and have done life with them, but that's not currently my reality. And man, did this hit me upside the head.
I think the biggest lesson that I've taken from both this and our recent coverage of PBS's documentary series Asian America is that we have to unlearn the history that we are taught of this country as whatever privileged group you belong into, gender, sexuality, class, religion, race, whatever privileged group you belong to, the best way to empathize and to then advocate for real equity and real equality, which we've never had, is to, we talk about this all the time, sit with other people's stories. But for me, it's such a profound way to like relearn history, unlearn what I assumed I knew about American history, and relearn it through the lens of the marginalized group you are focusing on. I've done that a lot with Native American and Indigenous people. I've done that a lot with Black folks in this country. I've done it a little bit with Latinx folks in this country, but I have never heretofore done it to this extent with disabled folks. And like, there's no, like, you can't put a value on that, I don't think. And it was really hard to watch it. I have family members whom I know very well and whom I love very dearly that have various physical and learning difficulties and disabilities. So I would have considered myself an empathetic person, but even this documentary forced me to examine and re-examine some of my internalized biases against people with disabilities. So, that's a really hard thing to do, but we both felt really, really strongly while we were watching it that it's necessary work. And it doesn't make you feel great, but that's not the point. The point is to sit in these other people's shoes and to me, re-examine a historical period that we've done a lot of re-examining recently, especially when we looked at the suffrage movement with the And Nothing Less podcast and Mrs. America and like the women's rights movement around all this time. And I felt like it was putting a piece in that puzzle that, of course, the disability rights movement came out of the civil rights movement because the civil rights movement didn't address disabilities in a way that was sufficient. And so you're in this time period of the late 60s, early 70s, where everyone is talking about we have to change society. And the other thing that I loved that we got out of this documentary was the power of giving people time and space to sit around with other people similar to them and talk about what they would like to see. And like, that's what came out of this camp was they all had very different experiences of being a disabled youth, but similar enough that like, this is where the guts of the disability rights movement came out. These were the activists that were in the sit-in at San Francisco State University. These are the people that spoke and testified before Congress about the Americans for Disabilities Act. And so what happens when you give people the space to have those conversations and to share their stories is it becomes a catalyst for action and change. And we really should do that more often.
It also gave them the chance to say the quiet stuff out loud.
Yeah. And
the things that it never even occurred to them that they could have in common with somebody else. And as we're talking, I'm realizing that this is something we will continue to learn about. We did some frantic Googling to figure out how to talk about this community. Do they want to be called differently able? Do they want to be called disabled? Do they want to, how do they? And the answer, everybody seems to have a different opinion, which is fantastic. And also one of the difficult areas we're just going to have to go forward into the mess. And if you've been with us for a little while, you know that a lot of communities that we've marginalized communities and groups that we've worked with, we've maybe have done that work off camera. We've done life with some activists. We've asked how to talk about it. We've kind of got it all down. And our wading into this particular intersection is going to be on camera. And we want to do that with you. And so you can see our process and how we learn. This is something neither one of us expected to be quite as affected by. And I'm really grateful to everyone who was in this documentary for letting us see you. And demanding our attention. And I'm sorry that I didn't give it to you before this. I've definitely thought about the ADA a lot, not only as a business owner, but as somebody who ran events. I definitely had to check boxes a lot about the ADA. I think about the ADA a lot because the phrase in it that you may not realize is the phrase reasonable accommodation, which we've talked about on other pieces of this channel. But I kept thinking that it's not a reasonable accommodation to ask people to go around in a U-Haul truck. It's not a reasonable accommodation. Like, it's not unreasonable to create a ramp so that people in wheelchairs can get to the House of Representatives.
Or like, I think it was one of the times when Jim was talking about going to a job interview and he had to take the subway and he had to carry his wheelchair up the subway steps. And I just like, you know, as willing as I am to accept the many, many faults and foibles of our nation, I was still shocked. And I was surprised that I was shocked that we disregarded disability access that much. It wasn't, I don't think, intentional. But it was neglectful because they just, why would we consider them at all?
But then it was intentional because they went to New York Transit and they said, we need this. And New York Transit said, it's too much money.
It's too much money. Yeah. And it's like,
but then it was intentional.
And then it became about the value of these humans' lives. And that like constantly they were told by so many governments, local and national, that they weren't worth the investment. And like, that is some real heavy stuff. And I just, you know, the dehumanization of marginalized groups is something we often comment on and focus on when we do these kinds of explorations. And it's how we build power structures in culture and society on a social scientist perspective. There is always othering that happens. And
we learn there's even othering that happens within the disabled community. There is even a hierarchy of disability.
Yeah.
And that was a moment to remember that different people are different and we are all the same.
The human beings act the same in all different kinds of situations. Yeah. And I think, you know, what we're also coming to is that the realization that within every space, there is such a diversity of perspectives and opinions. Literally everything is a spectrum. And we're going to keep hammering that point home until we feel like we don't have to say it anymore, which, spoiler alert, is probably going to be not for a long time. But disabled folks exist on a spectrum. And so some people might want to be called disabled. Some people might want to be called differently abled. So, you know, some people have reclaimed the word crippled, maybe. Some people haven't. Whatever. The best we can do is the best we can do, and try and treat people empathetically and individually as human beings and be respectful of their choices and the way they think about themselves. But I don't know why I struggled to be blunt with recognizing that everything was a spectrum in this case, because we say it all the time. But like parts of this documentary, I was like, yeah, of course they feel differently. Of course there's a hierarchy of like polio is the best case disability. And of course there's like internalized intergroup discrimination. There is everywhere. So there's so much in this documentary, but fundamentally, I think as upsetting as so much of the content was, I still came out of it with like the positive view.
Oh God.
This is what we can do when we get people together, when they're motivated for change, when they see a better future. And these people worked for decades decades. And I'm sure, not big fans of President Reagan on this channel. Sorry, folks. But I can imagine those 8 years of presidency were exceptionally discouraging for a lot of people. And to keep pushing because you knew what you were doing was right. It's incredibly moving to see that from this lens, through that lens for those folks. So.
And it was a good lesson for all of us too, that a huge part of allyship is just doing what you can and then getting out of the way. Mm-hmm. I think specifically of the reporter who just was tireless in doing his job, then the Congress people who stood up and did what they could and then stepped aside. And there was a Jane Pauley actually voiceover at one point that said there was a senator on the floor during the ADA whose brother is deaf. And so he delivered a speech in sign language. But it was the disabled people themselves that got the bill passed. And I had to pause the documentary and I was like, yes, and we need to hear that more often.
Yeah.
So this is completely a journey. This is also part of our Oscars 2021 coverage. We'll be talking about some other pieces of film that have been nominated throughout this Academy Award process. Awards are a joke and mean nothing, but they also mean what gets made next. Mm-hmm. So it's an incredible... it is a gatekeeper for how more art gets made. And so we want to investigate and spend a little bit more time investigating, and maybe we'll dip into the Golden Globes too. They're even more of a joke and even more problematic, but we'll dip into why these things are important. But art begets art. And what I really appreciated at one point, I'll say in this, is two more things. One is we're going to talk a little bit more about Willowbrook Hospital on this channel at some point. So put a pin in that. And the other is that there was I'm going to guess 1970s something or another television episode that wasn't about Willowbrook. It was about something else. But the announcer, who was a generic white man in a tie, and then there was like a red circle over here. He said, we've been like acculturated to think of people with disabilities as monsters. Mm-hmm. And they showed The Hunchback of Notre Dame. They showed Frankenstein. They showed these kind of things. And we're wrong. And so let's start changing that narrative. And then I pair that with the final statement of the documentary, which is a law is great, but until society changes, nothing changes. Until attitudes change, nothing changes. And I really appreciated this reminder that we've been having this conversation since the 70s. And we're going to need to keep having it because we're not done having it.
Yeah.
But we have been having it. And so if you're feeling overwhelmed a little bit like we are, you don't have to start a new conversation. Find a table where that conversation is already happening and ask how you can add your voice. You're not reinventing a wheel here. And so really great. If you're watching this and this really resonated with you because this is your life and you would be willing to come and talk to us on our Welcome to Our World channel or Welcome to Our World series or any other series, we'd love to talk to you. If you are a part of a community that is under the umbrella of the ADA in a way, and you want to talk about that specific experience, we want to talk to anybody about anything. And we invite you along with us, all of the rest of you for whom this intersection doesn't necessarily apply to you, as we journey to our own internal and external equity around it.
Whew, it's a lot of work, y'all, but we're not doing it alone, and neither are you. So come do it with us. Wherever you are watching and or listening to this, there will be ways to get in contact with us, to like, to subscribe, to listen, to share. Please join in the conversation with us. We love to talk to each other, but we love to also engage with other voices. So make sure to comment and let us know recommendations, thoughts, feelings, you name it. That is everything for this special edition of our streaming content, and we'll see you guys next time.
Bye.